When you choose to name your company Elite Simulation Solutions, you leave no ambiguity about how you position your products alongside the competition, and in doing so you create something of an expectation that you have to live up to. Simply the finest yoke available is how Elite describes this particular product, but talk is cheap and it's easy to dismiss this as typical marketing hyperbole. On the other hand, the market this company serves is defined by strict performance criteria, and the claims a vendor makes about its products carry less weight than what the products can actually be seen to do. Elite isn't in the toy business. For 20 years it's created products and systems to support real-world aviation training. Under the right conditions, pilots and student pilots can use Elite's aviation training devices to log hours towards private, commercial and airline transport pilot certificates, instrument ratings, flight tests and annual currency requirements. This doesn't, of course, mean you can plug an Elite yoke into Microsoft Flight Simulator and start logging hours in your bedroom. What it does mean is that as far as the FAA is concerned, and that also goes for the equivalent regulators in Europe, Australia and New Zealand, this yoke is as good as the real thing. Now, I'm not going to say any more about certified aviation training devices because this review focuses on using the Elite yoke in FSX, and I'll just make the obvious point at the outset that this yoke is expensive. It'll cost you about 3.5 to 4 times as much as the superficially similar devices you can buy in PC World, and that will likely put it beyond the reach of the casual flight simmer. It's interesting to note in passing that Elite sells those cheaper game controller type yokes alongside its own in its online store, which perhaps emphasises that these are not products it's competing with. So, the Elite yoke in FSX. It's not quite plug and play, and you'll need to install Elite's USB driver and FSX plugin before you can use the yoke in FSX. You'll also need to install FSUIPC, available separately, as the plugin relies on this. Either the free or registered version of FSUIPC works. Installation is straightforward and adds an entry to the add-ons menu in FSX, which is where you can set up and calibrate the yoke and any other Elite hardware you may have. Now, this way of interfacing a yoke is unusual, and there are some implications for flexibility, which I'm going to say a bit more about later. For now, I'll just point out that the yoke isn't visible to Windows as a game controller, so you can't just use it with any old game. Elite also provides plugins for FS 2004, FS 2002 and X-Plane, and although Lockheed Martin's P3D isn't yet officially supported, I can verify that the FSX plugin works fine with P3D. A yoke like this really has two jobs to do. It has to provide a way to control the aircraft in the relevant dimensions, pitch and roll, but in doing so it also has to mimic as far as possible the mechanical feel of the real controls. In most light aircraft that have this kind of yoke, it's connected directly to the elevators and ailerons by a system of cables, rods and cranks. The simulated yoke has to mimic the resistance of those control surfaces, which are deflected into the airflow as we push and pull and twist it, and it should provide credible control forces while giving suitably precise control across all parts of the flight envelope. First impressions are that this yoke does those things well. It's very smooth in operation all the way to the stops, although to be very picky there is a slight stop-start tendency in the pitch movement when making very fine adjustments. Resistance varies smoothly in proportion to the displacement from the central position in either axis. Aileron and elevator operations are completely independent, and it takes just under 4 kilograms of force to achieve full up elevator. The yoke moves smoothly from lock to lock in each axis with no central détente, but centering is assertive and there's some oscillation if you let it go abruptly. This is very well damped in the pitch axis, not so well in the roll axis. So first impressions are favourable, but to get a sense of this yoke's precision we need to put it through its paces in some of the most demanding situations. We're flying circuits here, trying to maintain our speeds and altitudes as closely as we can. We're most interested in how easy it is to do this in the turns, where we need to hold back slightly on the yoke to compensate for the loss of lift as we bank the aircraft. Now, the instrument rating skills test requires us to maintain altitudes within plus or minus 100 feet, and speeds within plus or minus 5 knots. I'm not instrument rated, so I'll aspire to the slightly more generous standards of the PPL skills test and try to stay within 150 feet and 15 knots. So we need 52 knots for the takeoff. Then we're going to trim for about 70 knots in the climb, more or less, and turn crosswind onto 070 as we leave the field behind. The yoke has a rocker switch under your left thumb, and this operates the elevator trim. The Elite yoke simulates an electric trim system found in aircraft such as the Beech Baron or King Air, but I'm going to stick with the Cessna style trim wheel in my cockpit. Incidentally, with elevator trim we've already covered most of the button controls on the yoke. Apart from this, we have a push button on the right or the left that operates the autopilot disconnect function. And that's it for buttons, although the second push button can be mapped to FSX's pause function if you use that. So downwind now onto 160 and allowing a bit for the drift. We're looking for, let's say, 80 or 85 knots in the circuit. It's kind of bumpy. I'm flying with active sky here and also Cumulus X, which gives me mountain effects. So it's quite realistic, although obviously we're lacking any physical feedback. Flying mostly by attitude, of course, with the horizon about halfway up the windscreen for straight and level in the Scout. Once we have the field in our rear 3/4 position, we can turn onto base leg 250 and start setting up for the approach. We want to slow down to about 70 knots, then drop 2 notches of flaps, which takes the speed down further, and pretty soon we can turn onto finals, looking to set up for 60 to 65 knots. We have a significant crosswind from the left, so we need to crab it in for now, having to work the yoke quite hard here to make sure we don't let the speed drop off too much. And as we approach the threshold, we're going to straighten up with the rudder and drop the opposite wing to give us a bit of a slip to offset that crosswind. We're going a bit long here, trying to keep it straight through the flare and just touching down on one wheel. This is another real test of subtle control, and the yoke works beautifully. There's no sticking and the back pressure's firm, but we can finesse it by feeding it in and out throughout the flare all the way to the backstop, even while holding in a bit of aileron. But subtlety takes many forms, so let's try that again to see how things measure up when we're being more assertive. Now, an aerobatic routine would be a better demonstration here, but I'm not up to it, so we're just going to go around the block a bit quicker. So pulling straight around into a 180-degree turn here. Now we're having to pull really hard to keep the nose up. As soon as we're in the downwind, we level out, then another 180 onto finals, and we've done that a bit too early, so chop the power, dump all the flaps, and cranking it over into a full-on side slip. Now that causes the speed to drop right off, so we have to push really hard to keep the nose down. Then straighten out as we approach the runway. We're quite long again, but there's still plenty of room. With full flaps in this aircraft, we need a bit of power to kill the descent, and not forgetting that crosswind, so we need to keep a bit of right rudder and dip that left wing at the last minute. Not pretty, but we're down well within the space and still quite smoothly. And there really isn't much more to say about the Yoke performance-wise. It's a well-engineered, no-frills device that does a simple job very well. It's extremely well built, with the case and all major components made of metal, and that includes the yoke handle, by the way. And at 12 kilograms it's heavy enough that there's no need to clamp it to the desktop. In fact, my only criticisms are about how it interfaces to FSX and some of the implications of that, which I'll just say a little bit about now. As I said earlier, the Elite driver isn't implemented as a standard game controller, it's an FSX add-on. An immediate consequence of this is that the yoke doesn't appear in FSX's controls dialog, so you can't assign functions to its buttons or adjust the sensitivity. It has its own configuration dialog available from the add-ons menu, but configuration options are limited and really don't extend beyond calibration and setting null zones. Most of the tabs in this dialog are for other Elite hardware, if you're lucky enough to have any of that installed. Although the Elite driver requires FSUIPC, I was disappointed to find that none of the axes or buttons are visible, so you can't fine-tune sensitivity of the axes or assign functions this way either. In fact, there's really no way to customize the buttons beyond choosing which of 3 built-in functions to assign to them. These are, as we saw earlier, elevator trim, autopilot disconnect, and pause. The Elite driver knows nothing about any other FSX functions. And I have to say I find this the most disappointing part. I fly with the virtual cockpit, and I'm used to hanging various combinations of FSX's view controls somewhere on the yoke. In fact, for me it's not much more than an inconvenience because I use a head tracker, but for those who fly from the virtual cockpit without head tracking, it's much more of a problem. And perhaps this is where we find a divergence between the training and enthusiast markets. Aviation training devices are invariably built around replicas of actual physical cockpits to some level of approximation, so it's easy to see why support for the virtual cockpit isn't a priority. Now, this isn't an insurmountable problem. For now, I'm using this PlayStation style controller blue-tacked onto my panel, but you could find alternatives. Taping a switch to the yoke handle would be possible, or slightly more ambitiously you could rewire the rocker switch to another controller. In fact, there's a switch blank on top of the other handle, so you could add a second rocker switch yourself. So lots of possibilities, but it just feels like a bit of a letdown for such a quality piece of kit. The only other software issue I found is that if you use FS Recorder, the Elite driver interferes with playback of elevator and aileron positions. This is annoying, but it's really only a problem if you're shooting movies, and you can avoid it by simply unplugging the yoke. But these are peripheral concerns and not really about the yoke itself. At the end of the day, its purpose is to provide aileron and elevator controls in a realistic way, and it does that very well. Yes, it's expensive, but let's not forget that what you're buying is genuinely a professional grade product rather than one that merely claims to be. Is it the finest yoke available? I couldn't say, I haven't tried them all, but it's way ahead of anything else I have tried.